This is the podcast overview for the Chapter 8 Objectives, which covers development across the lifespan. So the first objective is to compare and contrast the special research methods used to study development. So in the subfield of developmental psychology, there are particular types of research methods that are used, more so than others. And so the beginning of the book talks about what those methods are and why they're used. And so you want to be familiar with that. Also, explain the relationship between heredity and environmental factors in determining development. This is the age-old question of what matters most, nature or nurture. And really, it isn't a debate any longer, but it was for a long time. We now know that both play an important role in determining development. There are certain genetic factors, heredity, that determine things in a child and into adulthood. And then there are other environmental factors, which can be anything from where you live, who your parents are, how many siblings you have, kind of school you go to, that can determine development as well. So you'll want to be familiar with those. Then we'll turn to a little bit of biology here. We'll be looking at the role of chromosomes and genes in determining the transmission of traits and in the inheritance of disorders. So what kinds of traits get passed on? I mean, we could be talking about physical traits or psychological traits, like mental illness. And how does that relate to what one develops in terms of disorders? So that looking at the role really of genetics there. And then the process of, we start really from fertilization, and we're going to talk all the way up to death and dying. So here's where we start the stage theories of fertilization, the twinning process, how are twins made in the womb, what does sets of twins look like biologically, differences between fraternal twins and identical twins, what are the stages of prenatal development, and then moving into infancy, what are the physical and sensory changes that take place during infancy and childhood. So these are big milestones, right? When does a baby sit up, lift its head up, roll over, start to crawl, start to walk, and so on? And what kinds of sensory changes take place? So how does vision and hearing and taste and touch and all of our senses, how do those change over time as an infant moves into childhood? And then we'll start looking at some different theories of, in particular, cognitive development. We'll be looking at a couple different theories there, and here's where we see Piaget being a really big name in cognitive development and the stages that kids go through as they're learning information and material. So what was the brain doing when a child is learning? And we'll specifically take a little carve out to look at autism spectrum disorder. Then we'll move into the development of personality, relationships, and self-concept. How does a infant and child see themselves, and how do they see themselves in relationship to others? And so that's a big kind of concept, and that carries with them then through the changes of puberty. There's different physical changes that happen during puberty, as well as psychological changes as one becomes more aware of themselves as an individual. So we'll be kind of comparing and contrasting the childhood version of you and the adolescent version of you. Identifying cognitive and moral advances that occur in adolescence. So here's where Kohlberg comes into play. What kinds of things do we start thinking differently as we move into adolescence? And what is the role of personal identity that starts to trump everything else? This is sort of, the quintessential adolescent dilemma, is that search for one's own individual identity. And this influences largely the person's relationship with others. And then identifying physical changes and health issues associated with adulthood, kinds of things that stand out there, as well as memory abilities that change during adulthood, and common psychosocial concerns during adulthood. So here's this big piece of adulthood where we start seeing some of that, and you'll get familiar with Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, which actually starts in childhood and carries through all of your adult life. Different phases that we go through psychologically and socially relating to others. We'll compare and contrast 4 different theories as to why aging happens, what that looks like, and then end with Kubler-Ross's theories of death and dying. What did she say about the stages of grieving when someone dies? What are some criticisms of her theory? Comparing and contrasting also some cross-cultural differences on death and dying. Not every culture deals with death the same way or grieves the same way, so we'll look at some differences there. And then describing differences between the periods of adolescence and emerging adulthood, which is a sort of a newer area where you're not quite an adult, but you're not quite an adolescent either. So we'll look at some differences there. And that pretty much sums up the objectives for Chapter 8.